Tell me what happened, Donald. Every detail. Captain James's voice was steady, yet it held a simmering rage that made Officer Donald's hands tremble. Moments later, Anne's life hung in the balance, now under the fierce gaze of the captain. Her son, Donald, could feel the full weight of his mistake pressing down, and he feared what would come next. Welcome to our channel. Here, we share powerful, heartwarming stories crafted to inspire, move, and remind you of the goodness in humanity. If you enjoy tales that touch the heart and spark compassion, consider sharing your thought. Anne was a gentle soul, delicate as the porcelain vase that sat on her kitchen table. At 72 years old, her silver hair framed a face lined with the years she'd spent working hard, raising her family, and more recently, fighting the constant battle against her own lungs. Her bronchitis had been a lifelong struggle, and the asthma that settled into her chest like an uninvited guest only made things worse. Though she handled it with courage, Anne's life was filled with frequent bouts of wheezing and coughing, each one a reminder of her frail health. For the last few years, Anne had been fortunate enough to have the help of her nanny, Linda, a warm-hearted caregiver who treated her like family. Linda had made Anne's life easier, accompanying her on outings and helping her with everyday tasks. But today, Linda was away on a short break, leaving Anne to manage on her own. That night, the silence of Anne's small apartment was broken by a faint, troubling wheeze that soon turned into a struggle for each breath. Around midnight, as she lay in bed, Anne woke with a familiar feeling: the tightness in her chest, the constriction around her lungs. She reached out, hoping to find her inhaler, but after a few short puffs, the inhaler sputtered out, empty, leaving her desperate and panicked. Anne clutched her chest, her breaths becoming shallow, like trying to draw air through a thin straw. The darkness seemed to close in on her as she lay there, fighting to stay calm. She reminded herself to take slow breaths, but each one felt weaker than the last. She was alone, clutching her pillow with one hand and pressing the empty inhaler to her lips with the other. The fear started to claw at her, an icy realization that she might not make it through the night. She thought of calling for help, but she could barely find the strength to reach her phone. All she could do was pray and focus on each tiny breath, hoping for dawn to come quickly. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the morning light filtered through her curtains, bringing a sliver of hope. Anne hadn't slept at all. She had spent the entire night awake, watching the clock and holding on to the thin thread of her breath. Her body felt weak, and her mind was clouded with exhaustion, but she knew she had to gather every bit of strength she had left to get to the pharmacy and refill her inhaler. As soon as the pharmacy opened, Anne took her purse and, with trembling hands, locked her front door. Each step was an effort. She moved slowly, clutching her chest with one hand as she made her way down the stairs. Her neighborhood was still quiet, with only a few people stirring at that early hour, but Anne barely noticed them. She was focused on putting one foot in front of the other, all her energy directed toward reaching the pharmacy. The cool morning air stung her lungs as she shuffled along, her breaths short and labored. She stopped every few steps to catch her breath, leaning against a wall or a lamppost, feeling the strain in her chest. She was used to her body's weakness, but today it felt as though her own lungs were turning against her. The journey, though only a few blocks, felt like an endless marathon. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she reached the pharmacy. The warm, sterile smell of the place was oddly comforting, and she exhaled a small sigh of relief. She approached the counter, clutching her old inhaler in her hand like a lifeline, and placed it on the counter with a tired smile. The pharmacist, who recognized Anne from her many visits, took one look at her pale face and quickly handed her a fresh inhaler. "Here you go, Mrs. Anne," he said kindly. "Take a seat and catch your breath." Anne nodded gratefully and accepted the new inhaler, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders as she finally took a much-needed puff. The familiar, soothing relief washed over her as she felt her lungs loosen up, allowing her to take a full breath for the first time in hours. She sat down on a nearby bench for a few minutes, gathering her strength and steadying herself. Once she felt strong enough, Anne rose to her feet, holding her inhaler tightly in her hand as though it were a treasure. She felt a new sense of gratitude fill her heart. The air felt lighter now, her steps a bit easier as she started her journey home. Each breath was a gift, and each step forward was filled with the relief that for now, she was safe. Anne's mind wandered to Linda and how much she missed her. If only she had been there, Anne wouldn't have had to go through the terrifying night alone. But even in Linda's absence, Anne had made it. She had endured the night and pushed herself to get what she needed. As she walked, she clutched the inhaler to her chest, unaware of the events that were about to unfold and how one chance encounter on her way home would change everything. Her steps were still unsteady, but she felt reassured knowing that help was finally in her pocket. She clutched the small, life-saving device with relief, feeling its cool plastic against her palm. She was just a few blocks from home when a figure appeared in her path. Officer Donald was a young, clean-cut officer with a sharp jawline and a reputation for being overly strict. He prided himself on keeping things under control and rarely softened his demeanor, especially with people he deemed insignificant. In his eyes, elderly citizens like Anne were part of a disorder he had to manage, nuisances who slowed down his work and tested his patience. When he saw Anne walking slowly with a bag in one hand and the inhaler in the other, he stopped her abruptly, blocking her path with his hand raised. "Excuse me, ma'am. What are you doing out here alone?" he demanded, his voice flat and unwelcoming. Anne was taken aback, but she offered him a polite smile and held up her pharmacy bag. "Officer, I just came from the pharmacy," she explained, her voice gentle and weak. "I had to get my inhaler. I have asthma and bronchitis, you see." Her words, however, fell on deaf ears. Officer Donald narrowed his eyes, suspicion flickering across his face. "Asthma, huh? I'll need to see that inhaler," he replied, his tone edged with doubt. Anne's heart skipped a beat as she realized he didn't believe her. "Officer, please," she murmured, her hand tightening around the inhaler. "It's just for my breathing. I've had trouble all night." Her voice trembled as she held out the pharmacy bag, revealing her receipt and medication. She hoped that her earnestness would soften him, that he would see the exhaustion on her face and understand that she wasn't causing trouble. But Donald was unmoved. With a cold, dismissive gesture, he reached out and took the inhaler from her hands, ignoring her protests. "Ma'am, I need to check this myself. We can't just take people's word these days." He turned the inhaler over in his hand, examining it as though it were suspicious contraband. Anne's chest tightened as her sense of security vanished with the inhaler. She could feel her breathing grow shallower with each second it was out of her grasp. "Please, officer," she pleaded, her voice now tinged with desperation. "I need that. I can't breathe without it. I'm telling you the truth." Donald looked at her, unfazed. "I'll give it back when I'm sure you really need it," he replied curtly, ignoring the fear in her eyes. He held the inhaler just out of reach as if she were a child asking for something she couldn't be trusted with. Anne's breaths became ragged, and she felt a wave of dizziness. Her lungs were tightening again, and each breath came out in short, wheezing gasps. She clutched her chest, trying to steady herself, but her body began to tremble, and the world around her seemed to blur. "Please, I can't breathe," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. But Donald didn't move. He held the inhaler firmly, refusing to hand it over, still convinced that he was in the right. As Anne tried to speak again, her voice failed her, and she felt her legs give way. The last thing she saw was the hard, unsympathetic look on his face before everything went dark. Anne collapsed onto the pavement, her frail body crumpling as her breath came in desperate, shallow gasps. A few bystanders who had noticed the encounter rushed forward, their faces filled with shock and concern. One of them knelt by her side, trying to rouse her, while another urgently called for an ambulance. The once quiet street was now filled with murmurs of worry and confusion as they waited for help to arrive. Officer Donald stood frozen for a moment, staring at Anne's limp form on the ground, the inhaler still clutched tightly in his hand. As he slowly realized the gravity of what he had done, his face paled, and a trace of guilt flickered in his eyes. He had thought he was just enforcing rules, keeping control, but in that moment, he understood the weight of his actions. The ambulance arrived within minutes, and paramedics hurried to tend to Anne, their voices low and urgent as they worked quickly. They placed an oxygen mask over her face, trying to stabilize her breathing, and lifted her onto a stretcher. Officer Donald watched in silence, his mind racing with the consequences of his actions. As the ambulance doors closed, carrying Anne away to the hospital, Donald remained rooted in place, holding the inhaler that could have saved her from this ordeal. Captain James was in the middle of his morning briefing at the nearby precinct when he received a troubling call from the dispatcher. An elderly woman had collapsed on the street due to an asthma attack and had been rushed to the hospital. The details of the incident were vague, but a jolt of worry struck him when he heard the location. It was near his mother's neighborhood. James's heart raced as he listened to the description of the elderly woman. Frail, with short silver hair, and wearing a light blue cardigan. Unmistakably his mother, Anne. Panic took hold of him, his mind racing with questions. How could this have happened? Had she left the house alone? He didn't hesitate. Without a second thought, he abandoned his briefing and rushed out of the station, driving with his siren blaring all the way to the hospital. Arriving at the hospital, James pushed through the crowded hallways until he reached the emergency room. His heart nearly stopped when he saw her. There was Anne, lying still and pale in a hospital bed, her fragile form hooked up to oxygen, her chest rising and falling weakly under the mask. Seeing his once strong, kind mother like this was almost unbearable, and he felt a crushing sense of helplessness. A doctor approached him, and James immediately pressed him for information. "What happened to her?" he asked, his voice tight with emotion. The doctor explained that Anne had collapsed after suffering an intense asthma attack, and while she was stable now, she'd arrived at the hospital barely breathing. James's face darkened as the doctor mentioned something unusual. A bystander had reported that an officer had taken her inhaler, leaving her struggling to breathe on the street. James's blood ran cold. An officer took her inhaler. He couldn't comprehend the thought. His mother had been left helpless, gasping for breath, by one of his own. Determined to get to the bottom of it, he requested more details, and after a few calls, his worst fear was confirmed. The officer responsible was Donald, a junior officer under his own supervision. Not long after, Donald himself arrived at the hospital, visibly uneasy. He had come upon hearing that the elderly woman he'd encountered earlier had been hospitalized. He expected to explain himself, but nothing could have prepared him for the shock when he saw Captain James waiting for him. The look on the captain's face was one he'd never seen before, a mixture of heartbreak, anger, and disappointment. "Do you realize what you've done?" James said, his voice low but steady, barely concealing his fury. "That woman is my mother. She nearly died because of your arrogance." Donald's face drained of color as the realization hit him. The very person he had left helpless on the street was his captain's mother. The guilt washed over him, and he stammered, struggling to find words. "Captain, I didn't know. I didn't mean. I'm so sorry." But his apology fell flat in the face of James's anger. The captain's fists clenched as he held back the urge to lash out. "You didn't even care to listen to her. That inhaler was the only thing keeping her alive, and you took it," he said, his voice laced with restrained fury. "You left her to suffer for no reason." Donald's remorse was evident. His shoulders slumped, and he bowed his head, realizing the gravity of his actions. He had made a terrible mistake, one he could never take back, and now, The consequences were unfolding before him in the form of Captain James's wounded, angry gaze. The morning after the incident, Officer Donald was summoned to a private meeting room at the precinct. The tension in the air was thick and heavy. Donald sat at the table, shifting uncomfortably in his chair, waiting for Captain James to arrive. He could barely hold himself together, already crushed by the weight of guilt he'd been carrying since he'd realized the woman he'd left gasping on the street was his captain's own mother. The minutes stretched endlessly, each one amplifying his dread. Finally, the door swung open and Captain James walked in, his face a mask of controlled fury. Without saying a word, he took a seat across from Donald, his piercing gaze fixed on the young officer. Donald felt a shiver run down his spine as he waited in anxious silence, but Captain James didn't speak right away. He held the silence, forcing Donald to sit with the gravity of his actions. After what felt like an eternity, Captain James spoke, his voice cold and measured. "Donald, do you understand the harm you caused yesterday?" His voice was calm but sharp, each word carrying a weight that landed heavily in the room. "Do you know what it's like for someone to struggle for every breath, to live with the constant fear that any minute might be their last?" Donald swallowed hard, unable to look his captain in the eye. "Sir, I didn't realize," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me what happened, Donald." "Every detail," Captain James demanded, his tone unyielding. With a shaky breath, Donald recounted the events. How he'd seen Anne on the street with her inhaler, how he'd felt it was necessary to check it, and how he hadn't believed her explanation. I thought I was doing the right thing, sir," Donald admitted, his voice breaking as he relived his mistakes. "But I was wrong. I see that now." Captain James nodded, his eyes never leaving Donald's face. "My mother has lived with asthma and bronchitis for most of her life. That inhaler is her lifeline," he said, his voice softening slightly but still full of sorrow. "You took that away from her, and she nearly died because of it. Imagine if she hadn't been saved in time, Donald. Imagine if your actions had been the reason she never came home." Donald's face turned pale. The weight of his actions sank in even deeper as he imagined the heartbreaking consequences. He realized that he had failed in his duty to protect, that he had let his own pride and assumptions cloud his judgment in the worst possible way. Captain James took a deep breath and after a long pause said, "I'm not going to fire you, Donald, but you do need to learn what it means to serve with empathy, especially toward those who are vulnerable." He let his words sink in, then continued, "You're being placed on temporary suspension, and during that time, you'll be volunteering at the local senior center. You'll spend every day helping the elderly with their needs. Maybe by working with those who struggle daily, you'll learn the respect and kindness they deserve." Donald nodded, humbled and ashamed, but also strangely relieved. He realized that this punishment was more than fair. It was an opportunity to redeem himself, to prove that he could grow and learn from his mistake. A few days later, Donald visited Anne in the hospital. Her face was still pale, but there was warmth in her eyes as she looked at him. "Mrs. Anne," he began, his voice soft and filled with remorse, "I'm so sorry. I didn't listen to you when you needed help, and I'll never forgive myself for that." Anne looked at him, her eyes tired but kind. She nodded slowly, understanding the weight of his words. "I accept your apology, officer," she said, her voice gentle. "But please remember, you're here to protect people, not to judge them. Compassion is as important as strength." She gave him a small smile, the kind that was both forgiving and wise. "Don't ever forget that." Donald left the hospital with a heart heavy with regret, but also filled with a new sense of purpose. He began his work at the senior center the next day, committing himself to serve the elderly with patience and respect. Each day, he was reminded of the importance of his role in the community, seeing firsthand the challenges that older people faced. He assisted with their needs, listened to their stories, and in each interaction, he felt a part of his old, arrogant self fade away. By the end of his suspension, Donald had undergone a transformation. He no longer saw his role as just enforcing rules, but as being the true protector of the community, especially of those who were most vulnerable. He carried Anne's lesson close to his heart, and from that day forward, he approached his duty with empathy, patience, and a dedication to truly serve. Your support fuels our creativity and helps us bring more unforgettable stories to life. Subscribe now, and let's journey together in creating a kinder world, one story at a time. Thanks for watching.